Hello, once again this is the Lost Camper, bringing you two creepy stories from Reddit Nosleep. Gaze into the fireplace and let the story begin. Number 1. My girlfriends keep getting murdered. Submitted by Dude from Evanston. Ava was my first love, and like many loves, we were inseparable. Everything in my life revolved around her. She was my obsession. Friends will tell me our relationship was unhealthy, that we were too dependent on each other, but I didn't care. We spent every waking moment together, and eventually my friendships fell to the wayside. It bothered me not. As long as I had Ava, nothing else mattered. Our love was pure bliss. Unfortunately, as is so often the case in life, happiness is fleeting. Ava was murdered 10 long years ago, and it almost broke me. One fateful Thursday, I returned home from work to find our front door ajar. Screaming for Ava, I flew to the bedroom only to discover a mattress soaked in blood, with additional blood splatter practically painting the walls red. The room showed clear signs of a struggle. Ava was a fighter until the end. Her body was never recovered, but the forensics lab confirmed the blood at the scene belonged to Ava. According to their experts, it was highly unlikely she had survived the attack. The faintest glimmer of hope remained, and I firmly grasped onto it. We combed the surrounding areas for weeks, and when others gave up, I continued on alone. It took me over a year to accept that Ava wasn't coming back, if I ever really did. Tina was my second love, a raven-haired beauty who brought me back from the pits of despair. Her infectious smile and caring nature captivated me, and soon after meeting at a conference, we were dating. I was able to tell Tina anything. She accepted me as I was, warts and all. When I told her how, in my grief-stricken state, I had slept with Ava's best friend only days after the incident, she held me close and whispered,
"The past is the past."
I wept in her arms for hours. Tina was murdered on a cold Sunday morning in October. I returned from a weekend trip to find her sprawled awkwardly on my kitchen floor. A pool of coagulated blood shimmered in the sun's rays. Her throat had been sliced from ear to ear, face frozen in a look of absolute terror. That image will forever haunt me. Suspicion immediately fell upon me. 2 girlfriends murdered in the span of a couple years seemed like more than a stroke of bad luck. Within days, the cops had zeroed in, and I was placed firmly in their crosshairs. This despite my firm proclamations of innocence. Thanks to overwhelming evidence and an airtight alibi, I was halfway across the country during the presumed time of death. I was cleared as a suspect. Regardless, the police made it clear that I was on their radar. I'm sure several were convinced a budding serial killer had gotten off scot-free. Once again, I fell into deep depression, a dark hole I was sure I would never crawl out of. I quit my job and retreated from the world into the recesses of my own mind. Ariana was my third love. We met by happenstance during a solitary midnight walk, one of the few pleasures left in my life at the time. She was a tortured soul who had suffered just as I had. We bonded in our grief. Within 3 months we were sharing an apartment. Life once again felt worth living. As much as I was able, I never left Ariana's side. If a text went unanswered for more than 5 minutes, I would begin to panic and black out. Doctors said that it was a symptom of PTSD. Bless her heart, Ariana never saw this behavior as overbearing or controlling. She understood completely. Ever the positive influence, Ariana encouraged me to go back to work, which I did so reluctantly. I searched for positions that allowed me to work from home, and I was rather successful in doing so. Unfortunately, on one particular occasion, a major client requested that I meet him on site. The offer was too much money to pass up. I begged Ariana to stay with friends, but she refused. Thankfully, her sister Karen agreed to spend the weekend at our apartment, mostly due to my extreme insistence. On my way to the airport, I received a text from Ariana. I had left my wallet on the dining room table. This was surprising as I was so thorough when packing, triple-checking my bag before leaving. Apologizing profusely, I asked the Uber driver to turn around. He was nice enough about it. 30 minutes later, we arrived at the apartment. The driver kept his card. idling as I rushed in. Bursting through the front door, I immediately slipped in a pool of blood. Organs, body parts, and viscera were splayed all around me, coating the floor like varnish. Ariana and Karen's decapitated heads peered down from the ceiling, held up by nails and duct tape. The Uber driver heard my blood-curdling scream, which led to the horrific scene. For 15 hours, the police fiercely interrogated me, their frustration steadily rising. One of the officers almost struck me. Begrudgingly, the police released me without charges. Again, it did little to numb the pain. Although exonerated in the eyes of the law, the local media had already crucified me. I was no longer welcome in my sleepy hamlet. For the following 2 years, I wandered the Southwest, homeless and habitually intoxicated. Abandoning civil society, I wandered from town to town, committing petty crimes to sustain a drug habit. I describe myself as emotionally cationic, unable to feel anything, so that's how I lived. As a vagrant, I obsessively replayed the events of the last years, looking for clues or patterns that may have been missed. Over time, I developed a theory which I wholeheartedly believed to be true. The murders were committed by a man who I had wronged or was mentally unstable and lusted after my happiness, probably a sexual frustrated individual. Either way, this twisted motherfucker was patient, only striking when the opportunity presented itself, meaning he had found a way to keep constant tabs on me. In this state of mental instability and pain, I devised a plan to get my life back, to right the wrongs that had been committed. A first thirst for revenge consumed my soul. I was willing to do anything to achieve my ends. To catch this killer, I have to set a trap, and to do that, bait was necessary. Beth was my fourth love, or so I led her to believe. I cared nothing for her. Every poem, passionate embrace, and romantic gesture was a carefully crafted feat of manipulation. She knew nothing of my past, and I planned to keep it that way. I used social media to plant subtle clues in alerting the killer to my whereabouts. Every smooching selfie and status update brought him closer. I could feel it. For months, I continued to lay down on breadcrumbs until I felt ready to execute. On a dreary fall day, I told Beth I received a call from my father and that my sister was gravely ill. I had to catch the first flight so I could to be at her side. Beth insisted she accompany me, but I sobbed and told her this would have been a family-only affair. She understood. On social media, I told a different lie, off to Vegas for an important and exclusive conference. Although the conference was real, my attendance was a falsehood. The trap had been set. I hailed an Uber, only to have him abruptly turn into a darkened alley several blocks from my home. Without so much as a word, I flung the car door open and jumped a fence into a backyard. I can only imagine what the driver must have thought. Sticking to the cover of darkness, I stealthily made my way back, taking cover in a dense hedge behind my home. With a clear view of the living room, I texted Beth and asked her if I had forgotten any important papers in my filing cabinet. Now I had a direct view of her. As she was shuffling through the file after file, I saw a shadowy figure emerge behind her. Clad in black, the intruder was brandishing a large butcher's knife. I couldn't help but smile. Moving towards the back door, I watched as the knife pierced Beth's chest over and over again, blood spraying upwards like a fountain. Without the utmost caution, I slipped into the house, clenching my newly purchased pistol. Entering the living room with a newfound swagger, I surprised the intruder as he was carving a message into Beth's torso. In my mind, I imagined spouting off a heroic speech of honor and revenge before enacting my revenge. But my anger swelled to untold heights and I pulled the trigger before a word was spoken. My tormentor of so many years fell to the ground dead on impact. A single shot to the head, that's all it took. Rolling the body over, I was shocked to see a female form clearly visible beneath the saggy clothes. This was unexpected. Only one thing left to do, the big reveal. The killer wore a thick ski mask and I peeled it off, slowly, giggling with delight. Gasping for air, I crumbled to the ground when I saw the face before me. It was Ava. Sirens squealed in the background as I cuddled the body of my first love, holding her for the last time. Number 2. The Call. Submitted by Taxidermic. I had just gotten back from my lunch break when my phone rang. My job as a 911 operator was beyond boring 99% of the time. Just today I had gotten 4 reports of harassment, 2 people requesting an ambulance because of minor injuries, and 1 woman who thought it would be a good idea to ask for directions. I hated my job. Most of the time, but the few times I helped people, I remembered why I did it. I did it to make a difference in the best way I knew how. I couldn't be a police officer, my lack of a left leg preventing me from completing the most basic physical requirements. I couldn't be a doctor or a lawyer. I was already drowning in student debt from the 2 years college I had attended, eventually dropping out to take care of my mother. I was also deeply depressed. My 9-year daughter had died in the same car accident that took my leg. It tore my already flimsy marriage to pieces, leaving me with almost nothing. Despite all of this, I still had to help people. It wasn't an option for me not to. I had promised myself I wouldn't waste my life, and this was the only job I could find that I thought I could truly do some good with. So, when I picked up the phone and was greeted by a cold, calm voice who told me he had found Jessica Spiegman, I hope you can understand my initial lack of trust. This case was all over every news station. They were running this story. An 11-year-old white girl kidnapped out of her room. People went wild. Some claimed it was in response to her father owing money to some very powerful people. Some thought it was politically motivated, her father being a large contributor to the DNC, but most people just thought it was someone who wanted a ransom. When this calm man told me he found her, I think it was understandable for me to be skeptical. Okay, I wasn't skeptical. I thought it was a complete fucking bullshit, but still, this girl has been missing for 2 weeks. Her father was offering $1.5 million just for information regarding her kidnapping. I made my beliefs quite clear, but the man was not at all fazed. He spoke again, in the same calm, monotone voice. That he didn't care whether or not I believed him, but if I wanted to save 5 men from the most painful deaths imaginable, I would send someone to 704 Waterfront Drive. While I didn't recognize the address, I knew the waterfront was run by Los Soldados, a vicious cartel who used the shipping area to smuggle in literal tons of cocaine and meth every year. I knew no cop would go there unless they had to, and I wasn't going to risk the safety of a member of the police department based on an unsubstantiated and most likely fictional claim. Before I could tell the man to stop wasting my time, he hung up. For the rest of the uneventful day, something kept bothering me. It was the certainty of the man's voice. It was as if he was not just telling me what was he going to do, but stating a fact as simple as saying water is wet. When I clocked out, I decided I would investigate the warehouse. I knew it was dangerous, but I had to know. Besides, I wasn't unarmed. I always have my Glock 19 in the center console. As I parked outside the warehouse, shutting off my car, the silence of the area struck me. It wasn't a normal silence. It was a heavy one. It was a silence that pierced me to my core and left me shivering in the warm summer night. Grabbing my handgun, I stepped out of my car. As I slowly approached the warehouse, I started to notice it, the smell. At first, I thought it was just all the old rusting iron from the shipyard, but as I got closer, it became unmistakable. Blood. I stopped dead in my tracks, unsure of whether or not I wanted to know what I would find. Unsure of whether I should just walk away. Forget I ever got the call in the first place. The only thing that stopped me from running away, though I'm ashamed to admit it, was selfish. I needed the reward money. I wanted to go back to school. I wanted to become a doctor, to become a lawyer, but most of all, I wanted to help my mom. She was dying. She had been on dialysis for 3 years, and she was more than broke. She was surrounded by debt. She was drowning in it. So, I forged on, the metallic growing stronger and stronger until I reached the door of the warehouse. A weighty stench that filled my body with a feeling of nausea. Tentatively, I opened the door. At first glance, nothing seemed out of place. The main room looked relatively empty other than a tower of boxes that blocked off the far wall. Lifting my gun, I slowly approached the wall of boxes. As I did, I noticed things that I had missed with my first glance. A smear of red on the ground. 2 shell casings lying a few feet away from each other. As I finally reached the boxes, the stench became unbearable. I bent over and emptied my lunch onto the concrete floor. I retched until I had nothing left inside of me. After wiping my mouth and spitting several times, I stood up again and finally squeezed myself through a crack between the boxes. Words cannot properly describe what I saw. There were 4 of them. They were dead. The first was the luckiest, slumped over a table filled with chips and cards, his face now an unrecognizable red pulp, lying in a pool of blood. A dented maroon-stained aluminum baseball bat dropped unceremoniously on the floor next to him. The second one was not as lucky. Blinked by only a red smear, his hand lay a few yards away from his body. The rest of his body was covered in a series of long gashes. The offending knife was buried in his gut. While fatal, the wound killed him after tens of minutes of unbearable agony. The third was killed more quickly. Both arms twisted behind him at an inhuman angle. He lay on his stomach, facing away from me. As I approached him, I retched again, the smell of burning flesh reaching me. I threw up only bile. I fell to my knees and continued retching. This lasted for a few minutes until I unsteadily got to my feet. I stumbled over to the third man and nearly threw up again when I saw his face. An alcohol-soaked rag had been duct taped in his mouth, then lit on fire. Over half of his head was charred black. The fourth man lay in a pool of blood. His fingers, toenails, teeth, eyes, and genitals lay in a neat pile next to him. He was naked except for an alcohol-soaked shirt that had been lit on fire. I retched again. The retching continued for what seemed like hours. Looking up, I saw something I had been too distracted to notice before. A door to an office. I retched again. The retching continued for what seemed like hours. Looking up, I saw something I had been too distracted to notice before. A door to an office. Stumbling to the door, I pushed it open to find the 5th body. I recognized him immediately. He was Carlos El Coño Perez, the leader and drug kingpin of Los Soldados, hung on the wall, crucified. He was held in place by 2 machetes that were embedded in his forearms, the blades buried between the ulna and the radius. His chest was covered with whiplashes and knife carvings. On his thighs, in deep red letters of word Merecido was carved, deserved. Between his thighs was a charred mess. His genitalia had been fully burned off. Sticking out from between his legs was the machete that killed him. Buried in his taint, it caused him to bleed out over the course of a few minutes. Tearing my eyes away from the body of Perez, I scanned the room. The 3 walls that were not occupied by Perez were covered, floor to ceiling, in pictures. I attempted to throw up again. The pictures were of Jessica and the 5 men. They were beating her. They were torturing her. They were raping her. As I looked at the abhorrent photos, I noticed a small cot in the far corner of the room, and it was Jessica. I rushed over, checking her pulse. She was just asleep. Seeing her, a wave of clarity rushed over me. I called 911. 911, what is your emergency? I recognized the voice. Jake, it's me, Sam. I need the police and an ambulance down to 704 Waterfront Drive as soon as possible. Jake was understandably confused. Sammy? What are you on about? What's wrong? I'll explain everything later, but I need the police and an ambulance right fucking now. Okay, Sammy, I trust you. They're on their way. The line went dead. They never figured out I did it. They accepted my testimony as fact. They didn't see through the pre-recorded call. They couldn't find any evidence linking to me to the crime other than me finding the bodies I had created. I believe that if they truly wanted to, the police could have solved it. They didn't want to though. They were happy about what happened. Perez was far from well liked. They did, however, question my motivation for the killing. Chief Police did many interviews and spouted the same line. I just don't know what could drive a man to do something like this. I do. Love. A love for my long-lost daughter. One that I felt rekindled when I saw Jessica's picture online. They looked so alike. She reminded me so much of my own girl. So, I did for her what I couldn't for my own daughter. I did to her captors what I wished I had done to my own daughter's killer. Finding them was easy enough if you had the right connections, and finding the right connections was easy enough in my kind of work. I'm not ashamed of what I did. Those men deserved worse than I gave them. Hey guys, thanks for listening. And also again, I want to thank the folks who gave me the opportunity to read them. Currently I'm still looking for any horror, creepy stories, whether real or fiction. And if you want your stories to be read, please email it to thelostcamper87@gmail.com. Once I get enough stories, I'll read them on my future videos. Be sure to like my video and hit the subscribe button below